Join the Ungovernables. No filters, no apologies. This season, we're cracking open Uniswap governance. Welcome to a new episode of the Ungovernable podcast.
Welcome to a new episode of the Ungovernable podcast. Today with Abdullah Umar. He's the head of governance at Arana Ventures, an architect of Uniswap's cross-chain expansion strategy, and a key member of the Uniswap Accountability Committee, or the UAC. We are Austin and Joe from Alpha Growth, the premier DeFi operations and growth firm. Abdullah, welcome.
Hey guys, great to be here. Love the intro.
Yeah. Wait, I'm ready to kick things off. So I just wanted to ask to open it up, what else should the listeners know about you?
Yeah, just a long-time DGen who's tried to make something more professional out of this space, now working both on the, more so governance and consulting side and pairing that up with the investment side. And it's a perfect combination. So yeah, excited to talk about Uniswap today.
Yeah, likewise. Was it more of a DGen to start or more of like the actual investments start? What got you started there?
Well, really, honestly, a lot of people who get into crypto, including myself, have like this philosophical undertone of just not trusting like a lot of the establishment stuff and just questioning like money and all that. It always kind of starts there. That spark at least is present. Then always that always gets into like, what can I actually do? What are some of the tools that I can actually use? What are some of the DeFi protocols I can put some capital into? And then, the interesting thing about this industry is that you propel the momentum from every direction in terms of adoption because you add a financial component to it. So when you're invested in the products that you are directly like using on a day-to-day basis, it just becomes like a flywheel and you just get hooked into it.
Yeah, there's definitely like the habit loop, especially when you start to see, financial gain or anything like that, or building community, making new friends. I feel like that kind of ingrains the self within the DeFi landscape and just kind of the crypto landscape in general.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that works for like every industry. And this is the case with, especially with crypto now, because when you directly get into like these sort of permissionless protocols, you're interacting with people like all across the world. You don't know like how old somebody is. It's a very meritocratic system often. And then when you combine your like entire net worth with it, and then your reputation with it, and then interacting with all the social components, it becomes something very interesting. So,
yeah, it's hard to be only 1 foot in to crypto. So I'm kind of curious, just kind of want to know a little bit more of like the origin story. Like you founded Arana Ventures, Arana Digital. How are the two related, and like what's their focus and how you really got started there?
Yeah. So apart from just like exploring the blockchain myself and just delving into it on a less, let's say, professional capacity, the way I really got into like the whole Arana phase of my career was when like a mutual connect introduced me to actually a local real estate firm. So it's an interesting story. So there was a local real estate company, and this was during the last like bull run around early 2022, is actually towards the tail end of the bull run. What they were trying to do is come up with some sort of investment vehicle for their LPs. And of course, their LPs are a lot more conservative. They're more so on the traditional side. And they wanted to come up with some degree of a strategy where we can, provide them exposure to the space because they didn't really know how to do so. This is before like ETFs and all this sort of vehicles there. The main thing you can really just do is go create like a Coinbase and direct deposit into Bitcoin, for instance. So this, we essentially created a general strategy over the first year, laid out a basic fund. It actually started off with like a fund of funds, but we slowly gravitated more and more towards like a smaller cap fund, investing directly in on-chain assets. Like everything that we do is just on-chain. We only use DEXs for trading, for example. Very cautious about like self-custodying and all that. So it's very much, we have a very crypto native sort of thesis. And so we're just doubling down as that as one of our value propositions. Our AUM is relatively small, so what we aim towards is like smaller to mid cap assets, and our LP basis largely just traditional investors at this point. Now, during this time, I also got introduced to some other projects that I was working on, like on the consulting side, which eventually led like into the governance side. I had some exposure working directly with some of the more like centralized aspects of blockchain, where it would be like with a labs or a foundation. But then I never really had an intention of going towards a decentralized route until I started taking over the Michigan blockchain like governance team. So did that for a couple of years. And as time went on, we started our own, like spun out our own organization to essentially have more autonomy over our company. A lot of the members from our from the Michigan blockchain team essentially left and started working part-time at Arana. And we spun out Arana Digital, which is now more so a governance and consulting arm. And then we have Arana Ventures, which is more so the investing arm. It's a liquid fund based on small cap. So that's really the distinction between the two entities.
I have to say, it's been a pleasure working with you on the Uniswap side and the compound side of things over the time that we have been. And when you opened up this episode today about professionalizing the space, and I feel like that's you're definitely underselling that. You're one of the most professional degens I think I've ever come across.
Well, thank you for the kind words, but no, it's been great getting to know you guys a little bit more and seeing you because especially with Compound, for example, where a lot of the at least Uniswap has a lot of backing from like labs and foundation, for instance, but Compound is a different beast of its own, where I mean, just look at Leshner, for instance. He went to go start his own protocol. Like there's nobody really driving that vision from a centralized perspective now, and Alpha Growth really came in and helped like drive a lot of the growth in TVL. So appreciate you guys for that, and hopefully we can do the same on the Uniswap side.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's speak to that. So what was your pink pill moment? When did you get into Uniswap? Do you remember your first memory of Uniswap and how you got involved?
Yeah, so this is one of those moments where I actually don't have a pinpoint moment. It's more so it was kind of like a flurry of moments where I was just interacting on chain with a bunch of different like protocols since like 2017. And playing around with as much like DeFi as I could, and then just really like perpetuated further once like the NFT run sort of came, and over time it just became more and more ingrained. But Uniswap was always that sort of illustrious, like large, like business that had like a stronghold in DeFi and was, one of the most predominant brands in the space. And really going into it, I never thought there could be a contribution that I could personally make or people could easily make for the ecosystem. That swiftly changed after getting involved more in governance, because a lot of the perception people have for Uniswap still is that everything is essentially driven by labs. A lot of the innovation, all of the innovation is really just driven by labs still, but there are other ways to contribute to the ecosystem. But at some point it just seemed like, okay, there's this really large brand called Uniswap that I use for swapping all the time, that I can interact with. They have their own work going on, but I can't really contribute to it because, what can I do? I just use the platform. So, the introduction was really just a flurry of using a bunch of different dApps, and Uniswap was the king, really.
What was the origin story of the Uniswap Accountability Committee? What's the in and out of that?
The Uniswap Accountability Committee has changed since its inception. Now, it was created initially when, so just a little bit of background in terms of deployments. So Uniswap used to be on very few chains for a while. It was really just Ethereum L1, then Arbitrum, Optimism, Polygon, and a lot of these were initiatives led by labs directly. Now, over time, this became a more so DAO-led process. Today, we're on about, I think, 31, 32 different chains. So it's accelerated really, really quickly. But the Accountability Committee was initially created so that when these deployments were happening, there was a group that was overseeing that these deployments were done properly, that there was some sort of oversight, and it wasn't just like a willy-nilly process.
Yeah, when you say, if you don't mind, I want to double click on what really was the first problem you guys were solving. What were some of the issues that you were seeing with sloppy deployments necessarily? And we don't have to throw anybody under the bus, but I'm very curious to hear like what are actually the problems that you guys were seeing.
Sure. It wasn't really sloppy deployments. It was more so a precautionary measure to prevent, future sloppy deployments. So it was something that came prior to any like issues happening. The biggest instance where we realized, the biggest catalyst really was when the license expired, because anybody could deploy a V3 fork and commercialize it as they wanted to. We have an open source license now on Uniswap V3 ever since, I believe, April of 2023.
Before April 2023, nobody could do a friendly fork of Uniswap without Uniswap Labs leading.
Yeah, so what you would have to do is there was a different license, and that license essentially said for a period of time you cannot deploy a Uniswap V3 fork for commercial purposes. And how would you be able to deploy a fork? Is if you got the buy-in of essentially the DAO, and the DAO was issuing out license exemptions. And the last exemption that was given out to, I believe it was. So there were a handful of them. So it was like BNB chain. And then it was like Avalanche, I think Gnosis, and then maybe Filecoin. But there in the first half of 2023, before the license expired, everybody was just like rushing to get a deployment in. And that catalyst was really the reason why the Accountability Committee was instituted, because we were like, oh, once this expires, anybody can just do whatever they want. How do we make sure that there's a systemized process for making sure this is done properly?
So at that time, were there, like before the UAC, were there a bunch of people trying to go to the DAO and essentially say like, hey, we want to get the license to do a deployment? Was that part of the reasoning as well, as just kind of streamline and operationalize that process and helping people deploy and do a canonical deployment?
Exactly. So, I mean, the anticipation was that more and more deployments were going to start happening, and we wanted to make sure that we were ahead of the 8 ball, essentially. During this, I mean, prior to the V3 license expiration, there actually wasn't too much. There wasn't too much activity around getting a license exemption. There were very few. I think there were like probably 6 or 7. It is really, really tiny. But as we anticipated, the number increased over time as the license sort of expired. And this will be interesting going into like something like V4. It also has the license, that same exact license, I believe. And the duration, I think, is probably 3-4 years. You can cut it short, if I remember correctly. But V4 will probably go through a very similar process.
Okay. And so how will that work? Like once, because I saw Labs tweet V4 is supposed to come out next week. How's that process going to look like for the DAO going forward?
Yeah, that is something that we're actively talking to like the foundation about and trying to figure out exactly how it's going to work. But it's going to initially likely be a slow and steady rollout. It's going to be launching on more than likely just ETH L1 and some of the larger L2s where a lot of the volume is more significant. And then over time, some of the smaller chains that want to attain a V4 deployment would have to go through some sort of process where they would have to get a license exemption again, just like it was the case with V3. And like we essentially went blitzkrieg over the past year with V3 deployments. That's not going to happen with V4 likely. It's going to be a lot more. It's going to be a lot more gradual and released slowly. It's also likely going to be a more tough technical overhaul, uplift essentially. V3
Definitely
deployments are pretty straightforward.
I'm curious if you can just give a little bit of an overview of V4 hooks, what it's going to unlock in your mind.
Sure. So V3, just imagine pools as just a static entity. They just exist and they don't really do much except for allow you to swap. There was the concentrated liquidity innovation from V2 to V3. But like, what's the difference between V3 and V4? Well, imagine you take a static pool and you give it arms and legs. You make it more dynamic. You allow it to do more things and interact with its environment. That's really what it allows you to do. And what do I mean by that? These hooks are essentially the arms and legs. It allows pools to become more dynamic in the sense you can allow users to interact with them. You get a lot more optionality in terms of, okay, I want to do an on-chain limit order, or I want to go ahead and set up a hook that will allow me to have dynamic fees, for instance. Like you can more price discriminate based off of how much activity is happening on chain, what the gas is, what the volume's like. If the liquidity becomes drained too much, you can adjust the fees there as well. And maybe you can go as far as saying, hey, I want to start doing some sort of market-based price discrimination based off of addresses and become more like a traditional business. But there are a lot of things that you can sort of do. And it also gives creativity to various L2s to have their own sort of niche. For instance, like Coinbase, or rather Base will more than likely release multiple KYC based pools, meaning if you want to interact with a particular pool, there will be a hook that essentially assigns a particular identity to an address, and that's essentially KYC'd. And that will allow a lot more institutions to potentially know their counterparties who they're trading with, because nowadays a lot of funds, for example, don't want to trade on chain directly because they don't know their counterparties. So that it's
kind of a weird concept that you technically could be supplying liquidity into the exact same pool as Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, you could. It's obscure. That's the part, and that's exactly where the regulatory issues arise, where you're like, all right, we want to add some sort of like hook that prevents this from happening, and we want to know who's a part of this. Obviously, there's like I have my opinions on base and like all these like permission setups, but there's a market for it, and if there's a market for it, and Uniswap can benefit from it, hey, let's target as much of the market as we can.
I've heard a lot of definitions of V4 and hooks and people trying to explain it, but I think yours is my new favorite, the arms and legs. I think that's a good one. What use case are you most personally excited about? How are you how is digital gonna benefit from this?
Yeah, digital is going to be an interesting, because we usually just work with DAOs directly. I don't think it's going to be something that digital uses too much directly. It'll be more something that the fund may actually use.
The ventures. That's what I meant to say. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So there are a lot of things that are quite difficult to do through just an on-chain fund, because you don't have all the bells and whistles that you may have with like a centralized exchange. Like we don't use centralized exchanges, for instance. So one interesting thing could be, for example, like if we want to be more capital efficient, what we could do is use use a pool or rather a hook app that would essentially take any liquidity we're providing in a pool that is like sort of out of range and automatically just send it to a lending market, get some yield. I know you love this because of compound. Get some yield.
That was gonna be the use case that I shared as my favorite one. Yeah. Will you break that down just in case there's some like ultra new crypto people, what that kind of means from a high level perspective, how cool that is?
Sure. So when you have a pool, some of the liquidity that is being provided may be dormant. It'll be sort of essentially out of range in a certain tick range, right? So basically, capital that is not being efficiently used is lying there dormantly, but you want to still earn some degree of a yield on it. It's essentially out of range. So essentially to increase your capital efficiency, you take that capital for a temporary period of time, you send it to a different protocol, essentially you just lend it out on a lending market, and you earn yield on that. So you're constantly earning yield as opposed to being out of range or not earning yield at all times.
It'd be like your bank account. Automatically, you will only keep a little bit in your checking account. And then when you need it, of course, you can always grab it from your savings account. But in the meantime, it's earning more APR on your savings account than it would be in your checking account. Yeah. And it would do that automatically.
Exactly. And this will be interesting. This is where I get excited with like V4 deployments on other chains as well. Like one good example would be obviously like Monad is an app, but one good example would be Monad and like parallelized EVMs. It would be all these EVMs that are parallelized and are potentially higher throughput and cheaper to use. And if you want to send these sorts of transactions more quickly back and forth, it would be a lot more seamless to do this on like a parallelized EVM, for instance. So there are multiple different factors that you can take like add on to each other, because I don't know if this will be the most effective or efficient strategy, say like an L1. I may be wrong about this generally. Maybe the singleton the contracts that like V4 has makes it more efficient. I can explain that in a second, but parallelized EVM, generally like a Monad, for instance, essentially means that it's not like a sequential EVM, for instance, you essentially batch transactions together. And instead of sending them like one at a time, you can essentially send them together. So it's a lot more efficient of a process. That's like one basic explanation of it. And that essentially means you're getting the performance that you have with like current like parallelized parallelized chains, for instance, like Solana. The reason Solana is incredibly quick and cheap is this is one of the reasons. Parallelized EVMs exist, like Say, for instance, that you can try out now that have a degree of this functionality. But the one that I'm honestly most excited about, and a lot of people are excited about, is like Say, for example, like Monad. So it'll be interesting to see how V4 discrepancies are seen between different chains as well. And this is where a cross-chain strategy works well, is because you're kind of hedging your bets across different chains and see how they dynamically work there. So I'm excited about that.
How do you think it's going to work with the rollout of V4? What do you think are going to be the first few? Do we have any insight into this?
The first few in terms of the
Chains.
first teams that V4 is going to be.
Yeah.
So that's honestly like up to labs. I'm assuming it's going to go to the largest ones. So the largest ones are going to be obviously ETH1. There's Optimism because, well, Unichain is an optimistic chain.
Right.
So Optimism, Arbitrum, ETH1, and then probably Base. That'll be my like first like sort of roster. We're going to hear an announcement next week, I believe, in terms of the launch. So we'll get some more details then.
Amazing.
It's super exciting. I guess kind of want to touch on the multi-chain deployments, because I know you've been a part of and crucial to a few of those Uniswap deployments. And I was kind of curious, in your perspective, which one are you most proud of and why?
I would say there are a couple of variables. So the one that's had the most impact was the one we worked on for Base. So Base obviously has the highest TV out of all of the ones that we've sort of like worked on. We worked with She256 team and GFX Labs to essentially get that out and deployed. So that was probably the highest impact one. That one was easy though, because nobody was going to say no to that one. That was pretty straightforward. Yeah. The ones that I'm more proud of, I would say, are the ones where it was a little bit more difficult to sort of do due diligence on these chains. So for one example that comes to mind, the longest like duration one was Rootstock. So Rootstock is essentially like a Bitcoin sidechain. And it essentially took, I think, 6 months of like back and forth conversation with their team to essentially just do due diligence on like, is your infrastructure strong enough? They have like this interesting bridge mechanism, like PowPeg bridge mechanism, where you have to, for bringing like liquidity between different chains. And then they'd been around for like a long time. And the question was, why don't they have as much TVL? There were a lot of issues around there. Is there actually a target market? Because if somebody's going to be using a Bitcoin L2 or sidechain, they're likely already on Ethereum. Bitcoin maxis don't use that. So what's the demographic? So there's a lot of due diligence that can come with it. And the initial deployments we worked on, there was a lot more conversation back and forth. The new ones that we do is we just want to go out and do them, because what the mindset shift is pretty drastic. So initially it was, what's the upside? Now it's what's the downside, because I mean, there is really no downside as to deploy on as many different chains as possible, as long as the deployment is done properly. So if the deployment is done safely, properly, it's fine. But then Uniswap Labs, for instance, may have a different perspective where they're like, what's the upside? Why do we want to include them on our front end, for instance? So there's that sort of tension there. But the initial philosophy was, hey, we want to do due diligence as much as possible. So the one that I spent the most time on was probably the Rootstock one. The ones that I enjoyed working on in terms of like research on the chains and talking to the team, I think the Filecoin one was interesting. That one doesn't have terrible amount of TVL since it's a pretty niche chain. But that one was interesting because they were doing like the FVM, or the Filecoin virtual machine, was like compute over data. So IPFS is like the underlying like infrastructure of like where the data is stored. So that protocol, and then you have the economic layer, which is Filecoin itself, and then you have the FVM, which allows you to create applications that are interacting with like data DAOs and all that sort of stuff. And you may need to transact tokens in that process. So learning about that architecture was interesting. And then we also got to work with like bridge providers like Axelar to essentially see how we can structure this. So it really varies. Highest impact Base, the ones that I did more research on and spent time with, is the ones I tend to prize the most.
So you've pushed through countless governance proposals in one of the most massive active DAOs in the space. So you're definitely one of the best in the world at understanding governance and navigating. So what are some learnings that you can share? What's your secret on making that happen and herding cats, so to say?
Yeah, whipping votes. The best part about governance now. It's actually one of the more parts about governance. There's a degree of politicking that does come into this, where you just have to sort of like, whip votes whenever you want to reach quorum. So the process behind really this is, you have to do enough for the ecosystem and get yourself out there and make a name for yourself to a degree where you can start pushing these votes past. this lowest hanging fruit is try to find a problem that's like easy to solve. That is a very apparent problem that people likely would not reject, get that proposal passed, and then you have something to tick off. And then you continue to snowball that with different contributions in the DAO, showing up to community calls, participating on the forums. And once you have that sort of reputation established, you are more, you can get people to be more inclined towards like voting for particular proposals that you're looking into because you have that established base. But yeah, there's a degree of politicking where we still struggle to actually reach quorum a lot. Like we have to like towards like the last 24 hours in a vote, have to DM like all the largest like delegates and say, hey, did you vote for this? Can you take a look at this? What are the issues you see with this, etc. So there's still a lot of that. We're trying to solve those issues going forward with different proposals like treasury-based delegation, for instance. Unfortunately, it's been tough to get delegation naturally, like more organically. We've tried to talk to VCs and fund managers, et cetera, to do so, to give us like a delegation based off of our participation, but they're scared of legal issues and all that. So it's a process.
Yeah, we're still, I mean, the leader of the free world just launched a meme coin, so we'll see how the regulatory environment changes.
Yeah.
But did you run a similar playbook, or is that wisdom that you've accrued through the process? And when I say the playbook, I mean, did you go into the Uniswap DAO, identify a low-hanging fruit problem and solve it in order to build credibility?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. I mean, one of the things was the first thing was obviously the first proposal we passed was the Avalanche deployment. It was essentially getting more deployments out, before the license expired, and also having a degree of an impact on the conversations that were happening with like the bridge debacle that happened with the BNB deployment. So that was like an initial, my first like voyage into like the deep politicking aspect of governance, where you just get to know a lot of people. You voice your opinions and start to understand the process. And after I understood that process, I was just like, all right, I'm going to go ahead and look at how many other chains we can get to deploy over the next couple of months. And then a couple other proposals, like towards the end of that year, I think one of them was like a really easy one that we worked on with the consensus team was just to lower the on-chain like proposal threshold, because that was very high. It was, I believe it was like 2.5 million uni tokens. That's a lot of money. We reduced it to about 1 million, so more people can add proposals. That was a really basic function change. It's very, very simple, but it can create a notable difference in terms of allowing more people to participate in putting up proposals directly. So that's like one example.
Do you have a future in lobbying?
A future. I honestly,
if you could, I know this is such a derail of a question, but like if there was an industry outside of DeFi that you could get paid any amount of money to go work in lobbying for a specific cause, I just want to know personally if you'd be willing to share what that industry would be.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, the industry that I think is highly corrupt and we would want to like lobby in the right, again, this would always depend on like what direction I'm working for. Well, like healthcare is like one of the ones that's like the most important industries where it's completely backwards. It's and pharmaceuticals, like that's actually one I would not want to go into because I think I would just get my head bitten off. But it seems like one where if you are a virtuous enough actor with enough capital and the right backing, you can make a strong difference because it's so messed up right now.
I'd have to agree. Yeah. But all right, we can come back.
Yeah. I want to double click on something, Abdullah. You talked about the bridge debacle. Would you enlighten us a little bit more about that and what happened?
Sure. So yeah, this is an interesting scenario where, so in February, I believe 2023, there was, in January, February, there was a discussion around deploying Uniswap v3 onto BNB chain. Now, previous deployments that happened for Uniswap v3 were on these various L2s. When it comes to L1, things become a little bit more complicated because when you have governance like cross-chain message passing, which basically means like if we want to vote on turning on a fee switch, for instance, on a different chain, like on Optimism, we can use a bridge. We can use like a canonical bridge to essentially send that message past. But when it comes to an L1, it becomes a lot more difficult because you don't really have a canonical bridge. You have to use somebody like a third-party bridge, like a Wormhole or a LayerZero or an Axelar. And the two entities that were essentially butting heads to be the bridge providing the infrastructure for this deployment, and therefore likely for future deployments, was Wormhole versus LayerZero. So this is the part that became a debacle. Is this turned into a big controversy, really a battle of the cap tables, where they had different investors. The investors from this team and investors of this team wanted their respective bridge, which they had investments in, to become like the go-to bridge for Uniswap to use for cross-chain.
Yeah.
It's so incestuous.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the winner of that on-chain vote was Wormhole. And this actually led to the Uniswap Foundation creating a like a committee, like a bridge assessment committee, and they essentially did an analysis of all these bridges and said, all right, we are good with Wormhole. We are hesitant about LayerZero. We are good with Axelar, contingent on some minor adjustment that they have to make. Honestly, the bridge report has to be reviewed. It's been like 2 years since it's been done, so it's like not updated in my opinion. But Wormhole's been a good partner ever since. But like what our perspective when we were voting on this sort of stuff was like, we voted for LayerZero on the snapshot, and then we voted for Wormhole on the on-chain vote, largely because we didn't want if Wormhole didn't pass the on-chain vote, this deployment wouldn't have gotten through. That's the reason we did it. But LayerZero, our perspective was like the issue that people had, and this may be getting too technical, is like there was an issue between like their Oracle and Relayer system, meaning if the two parties involved in like essentially LayerZero's infrastructure collude, this could become like a big issue. So how is that relative to Wormhole? Wormhole has a Guardian set. I believe it is 19, 20, 21, something like that. I believe it was 19 at the time at least. Guardians, which are pretty well-known like validator, like infrastructure providers that essentially govern that network. And the interesting part is Wormhole has a lot better reputation now, but then their reputation was actually a bit more clouded because they had a hack that happened in February 2022, where there was like a $325 million bridge hack. And so that was a big vulnerability.
It was the biggest one, right? I think it was bigger than multi-chain even. I want to say.
Yeah. So that was a massive issue. So people lost, like they had a big reputation. Their reputation was really on the line. They invested a lot of money, a lot of manpower to essentially fix those issues. But then LayerZero, on the other hand, was like, okay, we're actually not complicated. We are very simple. Our code is very elegant and rudimentary, and we've got like 35 audits on this, and have a massive bug bounty program. And then Wormhole's here like, hey, we've fixed all of our mistakes. We are more reliable. We've been around for a longer period of time. These 19 validator clients, these guys are not going to collude. Your 2 out of 2 could collude, but our 19 are not going to collude because they have massive reputation stake. But then you get into the issue like, but they don't have money on the line, etc. So it becomes a absurd contest. But the result, honestly, from the bridges standpoint, it's actually funny because I don't think these bridges benefited too much. Like the winners did not benefit too much from this. At the end, it was too much of a hassle, just a controversy, because the main capital, in my opinion, what bridges make is token swapping, essentially, from going from one chain to the other, and token passage rather than message passing. Message passing is a lot less of like a profitable business, and we're not really sending many messages cross chain anyways as Uniswap. So it's mostly just a bridge to get affiliated with Uniswap is a big deal. That was mostly the idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, brand awareness, kind of marketing from that aspect. I guess in your opinion now, like where Uniswap's at, what do you think? Who do you think the best bridge provider is currently?
I do have to revisit that, but the best answer to that question is probably the answer that the bridge committee had. And that answer is it's a multi-bridge system. And where you have like 4 bridge providers or a couple of bridge providers that essentially have to come to consensus on a particular message in order for it to sort of pass. So you add a multi-bridge system. However, that does add complexity from like a consensus perspective and all that. And so we have to see if it's like worth doing. The fact that it hasn't happened and hasn't been funded means it's probably not worth doing right now.
Yeah, that's like a multi-sig of multi-sigs.
That
seems a little bit redundant. But then again, bridging is kind of still the biggest bottleneck in the space. So we'll see.
I mean, new bridges are also coming out. We're getting new innovation there as well. Like, for example, like a bridge that changed massively since that period was D-Bridge. D-Bridge was actually vying for a lot of eyes then. They were trying to make a name for themselves. And ever since, they had their TGE since then. They're really hunkered down on Solana since then. They've done really, really well in terms of driving a lot of volume. They're actually creeping up on Wormhole now, so they're like a good new entrant, and they make more money. They have a good fee model relative to other bridges, but that's different. That's like something that we look on the investment side. So we actually have an investment in D-Bridge. So that's like one of the reasons I mentioned it. But they're doing a lot. But what I mean to say is D-Bridge then was in a very different place than it is now. Therefore, we need to reanalyze bridges generally and commission a second report.
Is that something that you're planning on potentially spearheading from your chair, or is that something? Are you calling to the community right now to have somebody maybe step up and do that?
I've mentioned. Uniswap Foundation has mentioned it, that they want to like do it again eventually. I may or may not have an inclination towards it, but really the last bridge report was commissioned by the foundation. They're probably going to take care of it again. But if too much time passes and there is like more and more significant differences between these bridges, it's probably worthwhile taking another look.
So a lot of people have said that Uniswap governance and just DAO governance in general is too slow. Do you think that that's more the fault of the process or the people themselves and the incentive misalignment?
I think the general process is, I think it's personally fine, because the minimum time that it takes for a particular proposal to pass is like 3 to 4 weeks. That's like minimum. For some people, that is of course too slow. If you're coming from like if you're coming from a startup, I was going to say,
big time
traditional organization bureaucracy. If you're coming from a startup, that's a whole different like can of worms. But like if you're coming from a startup, it becomes different. Like a really good ecosystem to look at actually is Solana. So we try to get into governance in Solana. I think it was last year we tried to get into like Jupiter governance, for instance. So it's a two double-edged sword where Solana likes to move fast and break things, and it has a very entrepreneurial mindset. And I respect that, and they build and they ship and they do very well. I respect that. The issue is, one of the competitive advantages I would say that Ethereum does have is they have a more decentralized, processed community that does have frameworks for this sort of stuff, where if you go to a DAO, like in Solana, and you want to access their treasury, it's a multi-sig. You can't call a function to access their treasury. I mean, there are a lot of ETH ones that also do this, but like Uniswap does not have this. The Uniswap treasury is basically just a pool, or it's essentially just a contract that you have to call, and you have to pass an on-chain vote to access any of the capital that is present within the treasury. But if you pass a proposal in Jupiter, for instance, on Solana, you don't really enact any functions. Nothing is being called. You're essentially just giving like a thumbs up to the multi-sig team to say, hey, we asked for $100,000. Now you have to promise to give us $100,000, as opposed to a function executing. So there's a reason there's a process, and there's a reason it takes time. So the process for Uniswap proposals is right now is we have a 7-day RFC period for a request for comment period, where we have a discussion for at least 7 days, and then there's a 5-day on-chain off-chain proposal. And the reason we have off-chain proposals is to essentially get a sentiment analysis. I mean, I actually think people use off-chain proposals very incorrectly, where it's like they're afraid to go to off-chain proposals because they think it's the end-all be-all. No, it's a place to test your ideas. If people don't like it, so be it. Just throw something out there. So if that 5-day period passes, nothing is called, you just get like a check mark. That's basically what is the end for like a Solana-based DAO, for instance. But after that off-chain proposal, say, passes, that snapshot passes, it goes to an on-chain proposal where something is typically executed. And that could be like editing a text on an ENS domain, or gathering capital, or calling capital from the treasury to give to like a certain multi-sig. So I think it's right in its structure, but we can also reduce it later on with like optimistic governance and stuff. That there are innovations that can happen.
Question on the RFC side. So the process, you laid it out very, very clearly. One thing that we've also kind of seen and heard some feedback on is this notion of, if someone puts up an RFC, let's say they're just a really smart hermit that's never really been too social on the forums, but they're super deep in the weeds, and then they post something in RFC, they finally share their ideas. It's going to be pretty hard for them to get traction without already having a voice or having some sort of insider connection to a delegate or to multiple delegates. So I know that Tally, for instance, allows you to promote a proposal that's on chain. What would you think about how do you get more exposure to those at the RFC level? How do you incentivize participation in the RFC level? Obviously, you don't want people to be able to game it, but I don't know. I feel like there's definitely some room for innovation around the distribution of requests for comment.
Yeah, for RFCs generally, I think it can be tough, like if you don't have a particular voice in the community. That's why I always advocate for like do something that is at least easy enough to start off with, but you can't always do that. Like if you're like a service provider, you're not just going to be participating in governance all the time. You want to come to a DAO and sort of go through a process. For a lot of smaller aspects, like they've been like for grants, for instance, like one thing that we don't really want to have the DAO take on too much is like a grant that we have to vote on every single time. That's why we fund the foundation, for instance, to put out grants. For like other general RFCs, I mean, there are a couple of things you can start doing is just reaching out to people who are directly on the forums that you see are active. They may have some insight for that. A couple of people who have put a proposal on the forums or have DM'd like the accountability committee directly have gotten onto like the community calls, for instance, and that gives them like a voice in terms of, hey, go ahead and talk about this on the community calls and get some more exposure. And so it can get tough. You have to traverse like the environment with a couple of the stakeholders, but I think it's definitely possible if you sort of if you just go out and reach out to people. Most people will be relatively responsive if they're active, like delegates, for example. Or you can add like a sort of like prediction market aspect. I think something that like the Butter team is doing with with Optimism and Uniswap is you add like a prediction market sort of aspect to it. Where
it's gonna be interesting.
Yeah, that could be like an interesting setup. I think the next season like of Optimism grants is going to be using that. So
I think that's what I believe the Optimism team reached out to both Compound and Uniswap about that concept, and that's gonna be pretty interesting. Real quick, I'm dying to talk about the logo, and right now the Uniswap logo is owned by Uniswap Labs, and that's a good thing because obviously, if anybody were allowed to use every logo, then there would probably be a lot more scams and this breakdown of trust. But there starts to be a little bit of a problem when you have the DAO that votes on a certain deployment, and then someone does a new chain launch, but because they're not on the Uniswap front end, they don't get to use the Uniswap logo. And so it's a little bit of like this private label Kirkland brand. No offense, Oku, we love you. But it's a little bit of like a Kirkland brand, great value brand, Uniswap deployment. Do you think that the DAO should have its own logo, or what kind of solutions would you potentially come up with here?
The DAO, so the DAO would not be able to really, like, if the DAO has their own logo, they're just rebranding into a different company. The biggest advantage that Uniswap Labs has, or just Uniswap in general, is Uniswap. The name, the brand.
That's right.
What makes money right now for Uniswap? It's the front end. It's uniswap.org. Swaps that are done there are making them like an annualized, I don't know, like $50 million a year. So it's something that you can actually start monetizing well. So what I do believe, and of course I'm biased as a delegate and as somebody who's partaking in the DAO, is that the Uniswap DAO should be able to utilize a logo, or at least have like white label capacity to give out to certain deployments, to certain initiatives or widgets or whatever we're sort of like the partners we're working with, because it stifles like the advancement and growth that we're doing. We can't really utilize it to the fullness of our capacity. And for example, you know this well, Joe, is that when we're negotiating deals with like different partners, for example, like incentive packages, it becomes difficult to get the best deal when we don't have the brand, because every single company we're talking to wants the brand. And so I believe there should be at some point some sort of setup where we can white label the brand. When we have a legal entity in place, the DAO has a legal entity in place, so it'll be a lot easier, because who do you essentially give like that white labeling? Like, who do you give that capacity to? If you can give it to like an entity, it becomes a lot easier. So if we can come to some agreement with labs on that eventually, I think that is definitely something we want to push because it is where the value lies.
Yeah, and I feel like that makes total sense. And I kind of want to touch on, because we're getting almost through the podcast. I just wanted to ask a question. If you had total control of the Uniswap DAO and treasury, what initiatives would you do? What would you pass through?
You have 41 million votes delegated to you right now. What are we doing?
Oof. Well, there are a couple of things.
Okay.
The first thing obviously would be, so we worked with a couple of folks in the ecosystem, including Carpet Key, Stable Lab, and Franklin DAO to like release a general treasury report where one of the recommendations is like building a stability fund for the DAO. So essentially diversifying out of Uni or issuing Uni for the establishment of this fund so that we can cover our costs essentially in perpetuity. Because right now, Uni treasury is just native assets. It's like unissued shares. What I would do if I had voting power is I would go in and I would start earning revenue for the DAO, operating revenue directly from, say, pools. Unichain comes on, sequencer fees potentially. This is a delicate one. This can get tricky. Fees can get tricky because you're diluting other stakeholders, which is another different conversation. But what I would want to do is work with, analyze the data and look at what's an optimal balance in terms of how much can we take in fees as to not dilute other stakeholders and push them out of the system. You can also turn on fees for hooks. So V4, you can turn on fees for like hooks. You can take sequencer fees and you can take fees from pools. And then the other part would be we want to earn non-operating income, because if we're not going to be turning on fees, it's really important that we have non-operating income from other investments, whether it's just staking based in ETH directly, or whether it's being more aggressive and going out and buying a more like intricate portfolio of different assets and being more, or like going out and buying like an activist stake in a certain protocol, etc. But what I would do is like lay out a more formalized plan for the DAO, for the treasury management, revenue sources, operating and non-operating, create a stability fund. And if you have a stability fund and a large treasury that is diversified, you have a lot of power in the DeFi space, and you can do a lot with that and remove any sort of dependencies and ties on potential reliance on, say, like labs in the future. For instance, if we don't start doing this now, it will only take us longer to be more like unfetter ourselves from, say, like the reliance on labs. I love labs. Labs does a lot of great works, but we have to think long term.
True. You almost have to think about yourself, how you're going to be sustainable, generate revenue. Out of all those you listed, which one do you think is going to be the most impactful?
Yeah, the first thing, like I think fee switch is probably the most impactful right away, because the disenfranchised token holders who are currently maybe holding a degree of resentment for delaying this for so long and, seeing labs earn all these fees, I think that would be the best for the community overall. Now, the question for the DAO is interesting though, because the DAO, the structure that was introduced by Foundation like about a year ago, was that you have to stake your Uni. And if you stake your Uni, this is the Uni staker, essentially the Unistaker contract. So you would have to stake your Uni and you would earn fees on the Uni that you stake. So not the circulating Uni, just the ones that you stake. So what the DAO would have to do is stake some of their Uni. What happens if the DAO stakes Uni is you dilute the other stakeholders.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it becomes a little bit of a balancing act. That's why I want to emphasize the non-operating revenue part, because I think operating revenue is going to be relatively lackluster for the DAO, and it's not going to cover all the operations that we.
Okay. No, I like that. I feel like the fee switch has been a topic of discussion for the last few podcasts. So excited to dive in more with future folks as well.
Do you have specifics on numbers and commercials of what, in your eyes, I know I don't want to put you on the spot, but if there's like specific percentages and tiers, and what would that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that's like debated as well. With a lot of people think that we should just go, because essentially how it works is you take a portion of the fees that are essentially being given to LPs. So essentially you don't want to make it too high, because that may cannibalize the margins that LPs already have, and it's pretty marginal already, so it becomes a struggle. So the lowest is, I think, 1/10 of that, and the highest is probably like 1/5 or 1/4. I think it's probably 1/4 of that. A middle ground is probably a decent area to start off with. The other caveat is you don't just turn it on for everything. Usually that's not how it works. You don't just turn on every single pool and on every single chain. It's a gradual rollout. At least that's like the recommendation made by parties like Gauntlet, for instance. But I would advocate for a higher tier, generally speaking. And from the analysis that they've done is like it's beneficial to turn on the fees. Generally speaking, the higher it will be, the more revenue we'll actually earn. If you annualize it, maybe it's like $50 to $100 million, something anywhere between that, depending upon like the structure. But I would generally advocate for higher fees and make the rollout relatively more quickly. Learn from your mistakes and iterate, because you can also adjust it. So higher fees, in my opinion, is probably better.
That's a great idea, because you could almost have like a 3-pronged or 4-pronged approach, right? You could A/B test it across different chains, see the impact, see the numbers, kind of understand where that range is. 'Cause it's probably going to depend on the assets as well, right? Blue chips are going to be different than long tail assets. So I think that's a great recommendation on how to open up and turn on that fee switch.
Yeah, you can check out a lot of different things and look at the elasticity of certain LP providers and see like how, to what extent, to what degree they're affected. Look at different pools, like you said, stable pools, stable large cap pools, long tail pools. On something like, I don't know, if you're in base meme coins, maybe you just like turn it up all the way up, and because people don't care. People don't care so much.
Yeah, exactly.
As you can on base, but then on other ones, maybe you want to be a little bit more cautious because depth matters. And as soon as you start losing liquidity in particular pools, you create a vicious spiral where the execution and the price for certain assets for certain pools is not advantageous, and therefore you start losing users, and therefore less fees, and therefore less LPs. So you want to make sure you don't go into a spiral.
I think as it evolves, I think more and more dexes are going to turn this on. So whoever kind of stands up, and if there's any blue chip name to do it, I think it's Uniswap. And once that happens, then it'll just be the status quo, and LPs will say, well, no matter where I go, I'm going to have to share some of my fees with the token holders. So I think it's going to be a gold standard, and it would be nice to see Uniswap do it. But we're rounding third here on the hour. We really appreciate your time. Let's do some fun little rapid fire questions. Don't give them too much thought. Okay, first one: Bitcoin or ETH?
Bitcoin.
All right, Telegram or Discord?
Telegram.
Nice.
L2s or alternative L1s?
Alt L1s.
What's your favorite one?
Solana.
Okay.
Oh, nice. All right. Well, how about most overrated token?
I'm gonna go with, all right, coming from the Uniswap side, I'm gonna go with like Arrow. Yeah.
It works. It's hard to argue. Fair enough, though. We'll take it. What's a chain you would never want Uniswap to deploy to?
Like I said, I'm pretty liberal with the chains that we want to go on. It probably had to be something like Pulse Chain. Something that we just definitely want to stay like, don't touch with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah. Just avoid any legal trouble down the road. All right. If all of your crypto vanished tomorrow, would you stick with DeFi or get a real job?
I love this question.
I'd love to not even consider that, but if vanished, what I would want to probably do is, what I really like about some of the stuff that's happening with with crypto is there are a lot of other use cases generally that are like legitimate real world use cases. One of the ones that I love and I think is highly underrated is DePIN, for instance. Some of the stuff that like I love to explore is how we can sort of apply this to stuff like I don't know, like navigation, GPS. Like GeoNet is a great project. HiveMapper is another great project that are very interesting, that are affecting like how you can compete against like Google Maps or like satellite companies. So the utilization of crypto in some of those sort of areas is what I would potentially start exploring if DeFi just like sort of like disappeared there. But because you can still utilize blockchain for different coordination and capital formation mechanisms, and I think those are some of the coolest projects out there.
Okay. I like that. It's kind of like in parallel, a peripheral aspect.
Yeah, it's like you learn the power of blockchain and then apply it to other aspects. But like,
yeah. I like it.
All right, hot or cold wallet?
Cold wallet, because I'm paranoid.
Which one?
It makes sense.
Cold wallet. Use Keystone is one we use for like more secure aspects, but then Ledger for efficiency's sake, it works. It does the job. So shifting between the two. So usually if I'm like isolating my assets and not connecting to any dApps, send it to a Keystone. If I'm interacting with dApps, I use a Ledger. And then if I just don't care, it'll probably just be a hot wallet. But yeah.
Makes sense.
What's your favorite hot wallet?
Oh, I mean, the one I've been using most is Phantom recently on Solana. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you are a degen. You hide it well.
Okay, what about this one? Yield farming or staking?
Oh, I would probably go with. I mean, why not both? So you go with staked asset and go use some yield product. Go use get your staked ETH and go use like Pendle or
I like it.
some
Keep the party going.
stuff.
Yeah, flywheel. Let's make it.
What's the most toxic governance community that you've ever witnessed?
That one I'd rather not say because most of the governance communities that I'm in, I'm still a part of. There
Fair
actually
enough.
hasn't been a governance community that I have left yet.
Okay.
So we'll reserve that question for when I retire from a particular governance community.
Okay.
We'll bring you back on then after
That's
that.
very fair.
All right, next hot narrative.
Next hot narrative. Oh, one I really hoped as well. I'm just going to go back to Deepin. I think Deepin is one of the most interesting narratives that has a lot of potential, and it's one of the ones that you can most easily explain and sell to people, and say, hey, you can see crypto being utilized directly here by buying some sort of hardware device, like putting up a dash cam or like a router in your house, and it works well. And over time, these companies are, they're gathering more and more customers and burning more and more of their tokens, largely because there's like an interesting network effect. Because when you put a bunch of hardware devices around the world, and to essentially collect all that sort of data, you need at least a certain threshold of like exposure. A lot of these companies are getting that exposure, like GeoNet, for instance, is getting that exposure and starting to work with some of the largest clients that essentially are usurping some of the more incumbents in the space and collecting more and more revenue. So I think this is going to do well over the next couple of years. It may be a slow and steady road, and some projects will die in the process, but I think it's one of my favorite sectors.
All right, I love it.
With that, give us some alpha as we close out of here. What are some projects that, and obviously, look, we expect that you are heavily invested in everything you're about to show right now, so you don't even have to disclose that. But what's some alpha?
One that you can use. Okay, so AI agents have been a big hot topic recently, so I'll go with that sort of trend. One asset that has been overlooked largely, and one asset that I think is really, really, really interesting is a project called Botto. So BOTTO is the token. We do own it, as you said, but essentially it's like a decentralized. It comes into DAOs. Like you can essentially collectivize token voting to essentially pick which art pieces you like, and essentially train an algorithm in a sort of decentralized way. And at the end of each cycle, I think cycles are like on a weekly basis, you have a certain painting that gets the most voting power. And again, your voting power is proportional to your stake in the project.
Yeah.
Projects that get the most voting power are auctioned off on Super Rare. There's one that's live right now. It's auctioning for $300,000. Revenue from that is partially given back to token holders. So there's a revenue generating part. There's a strong PE for this, and it's AI agents. You got the narrative there.
So it's a little bit like Pump.Fun, but instead of meme coins, it's a little bit more of this digital art. Is that fair to say?
Anything, though. It's not like a permissionless launch aspect. It's something where you essentially go in, and as a community, the biggest part, like AI art, just generally is not going to do well. What's going to do well is if you collectively curate something with a community on its back, and based off of what the community selects, you auction that piece off. So you're contributing to the creation of that piece.
That's cool. That's a cool narrative. Yeah, there's a lot you could do with that. Definitely, like songwriting, for instance, or everybody votes on what lyrics should come next. Yeah, that'd be super cool. All right, Mr. Abdullah, if you had one wish, genie in a bottle, what would you want to see in the next 12 months for the Uniswap DAO?
Next 12 months, I would want to see the implementation of a treasury management framework supplemented with revenue streams being activated.
And who needs to step up to make that happen?
Well, the main thing will be we'll just need a legal entity. Once that legal entity is in place, we will have more ease in terms of getting there. So really a lot of the onus is
Foundation.
on the foundation to help out facilitate that process.
Beautiful.
I love it. I love it.
I hope the same. Where can we follow? Where can everybody follow what you're up to and all the exciting stuff you're working on?
Just look at me and lurking on the Uniswap forums or on my Twitter at ABDULLAHBUMAR. So
beautiful. We've got it down in the banner as well. And Abdullah, we very much appreciate you. Awesome guest. Still a lot to cover. So maybe in a couple months you can come back and we can talk about all the new stuff with Unichain and V4, and we'll have a lot more ground to cover.
Would love to. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, I really appreciate you. Thanks everybody for joining
Thanks,
us.
Abdullah.
We will see you next week for another episode of The Ungovernables.
This was the Ungovernable podcast by Alpha Growth. Watch all our episodes on YouTube or Spotify or weekly live on X. This was the Ungovernable podcast by Alpha Growth. Watch all our episodes on YouTube or Spotify or weekly live on X.